"Nobody's coming," the voice on the phone said. "Not one of them." Garrett Hale smiled, poured himself a scotch, and toasted the empty air. Upstairs, his cousin, the most feared man in Boston, sat alone at a table set for 30 people. 30 crystal glasses, 30 untouched plates, 30 candles that had burned down to nothing without a single guest arriving to see them lit. Garrett had spent 8 months making sure of it. Every call intercepted, every loyalty quietly purchased, every ally turned. He had paralyzed the man's body 3 years ago. Tonight he was finishing the rest. If you've never watched someone smile at another man's complete destruction, stay with us. You're about to. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The dining room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Hotel was one of the most expensive private spaces in all of Boston. You didn't rent it unless you had money. Real money. The kind that didn't ask questions about where it came from. The chandeliers alone cost more than most people made in a year, and the table, a single slab of dark walnut that ran the length of the room, had been set for exactly 30 guests. 30 chairs, 30 place settings, 30 crystal glasses filled with water that had grown lukewarm sitting untouched for over an hour. Rowan Hale sat at the head of that table and stared at the empty chairs. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He didn't touch the water. He didn't touch the bread. He didn't look at the birthday cake the hotel staff had brought in at 7 o'clock sharp, a 3-tiered thing with white frosting, and 38 candles that had long since burned down to nothing without anyone lighting them. He just sat. His wheelchair was positioned at the exact center of the head seat, the way his aide Marcus always placed it, straight centered with the armrests level. Rowan had stopped noticing the chair years ago. After the shooting, after the surgeries, after the months of rehabilitation that ultimately gave him nothing back below the waist, the wheelchair had simply become part of him, the way a scar becomes part of skin. You stop seeing it. You stop thinking about it. You just live inside of it. But tonight, in this room full of nothing, the chair felt heavier than it ever had. 7 o'clock had come and gone, then 7:15, then 7:30. Marcus had stood near the door for the first 40 minutes, checking his phone, relaying messages in a low voice, his face getting tighter and tighter with every passing minute. At 8 o'clock, he had walked to Rowan's side and spoken quietly. "Mr. Hale, I've reached out to 12 of the confirmed guests. 6 of the phones went straight to voicemail. 3 said they were delayed, 2 didn't answer at all, and 1—" Marcus had paused there, and the pause itself said everything. 1 said he wasn't coming, said he had a prior commitment he'd forgotten about. Rowan had looked at Marcus for a long moment. Which one? DeLuca. Sal DeLuca. A man Rowan had pulled out of a federal indictment 7 years ago by spending money he hadn't had and calling in favors he'd spent a decade building. A man who had stood in this very hotel 3 years ago and told Rowan in front of witnesses that he would take a bullet for him. "Fine," Rowan had said. "We'll wait." So they waited, and no one came. By 8:30, Marcus had quietly dismissed the serving staff. He didn't ask Rowan's permission. He just did it because standing in front of 30 empty chairs while uniformed servers hovered in the corners was a humiliation that didn't need an audience. Rowan didn't say a word about it. He appreciated the gesture more than he could say. By 9 o'clock, Rowan understood. Not suspected. Not feared. Understood with the cold and complete certainty of a man who had spent 20 years reading people for a living, reading rooms, reading the space between what someone said and what they meant. He understood that this was not a coincidence of scheduling conflicts and forgotten commitments. This was coordinated. This was deliberate. 30 people had been contacted, had confirmed, had made arrangements, and then all at once, every single one of them had simply decided not to come. That kind of thing didn't happen by accident. Rowan reached out and picked up his water glass. He held it for a moment, feeling the temperature of it the way it had gone from cold to room temperature in the span of an evening. Then he set it back down without drinking. "Marcus," he said. "Sir, go home." Marcus didn't move immediately. "Mr. Hale, I can stay." "I know you can." Rowan's voice was level. Not angry, not sad, just level in the way that men sound when they've decided to feel nothing until they can afford to feel something. "I'm asking you to go home. I'll call you when I need the car." A long pause. Then Marcus said, "Happy birthday, sir." And his voice cracked slightly on the last word in a way that Marcus clearly hadn't intended and that clearly embarrassed him. "Thank you, Marcus." The door closed, and Rowan Hale, who had once been the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, sat alone in a room built for 30 people and listened to the sound of absolutely nothing. He had known on some level that things were shifting. You didn't build what he had built without developing a finely tuned awareness of the ground beneath your feet. And for the past 8 or 9 months, the ground had felt different. Subtle things. A phone call that went unreturned for 2 days instead of 2 hours. A meeting rescheduled once then, twice, then quietly dropped. A lieutenant who used to walk into a room first and now walked in last, positioning himself near the exit. These were small signals, each one individually meaningless, but Rowan had collected them the way a doctor collects symptoms, with patience, with attention, and with a growing dread he hadn't allowed himself to name until tonight. Tonight they had named it for him. 30 empty chairs. That was the name. He thought about the years it had taken to build what he had. Not just the money, though. The money had been staggering. The port operations alone had moved hundreds of millions through carefully constructed shells and legitimate fronts. Not just the territory, though. At its peak, his network had stretched from the South Boston docks to the financial corridors of downtown, with tendrils reaching into Providence and New Haven and the upper edges of New York. What had taken the most time, what had cost him the most personally, was the loyalty. Convincing people to trust him. Convincing them that the word of Rowan Hale meant something permanent, that when he made a promise it was as good as written in stone. He had believed it himself. He thought about the night of the shooting almost 3 years ago now, a Tuesday evening in November outside a restaurant in the North End that he'd been going to since his 20s. He'd been walking to his car, walking, which was a word that already felt like it belonged to another man's life, when the first shot took him in the back. He remembered the sound of it, which was not the dramatic explosion that movies suggested, but something smaller and more ordinary, like a heavy book dropped on a hardwood floor. He remembered the impact, the way his legs had simply ceased to be a thing he controlled as if someone had flipped a switch somewhere in his nervous system. He remembered the pavement, cold and gritty against his face. He didn't remember much after that. The surgeons later told him he'd been clinically dead for 4 minutes on the operating table. 4 minutes in which whatever Rowan Hale was, whatever made him him, had simply been absent from the world. He thought about that sometimes, what those 4 minutes meant, whether anything had happened in them that he simply couldn't access. What he knew for certain was that he had woken up to a different life. The wheelchair, the spinal damage that the doctors described in careful, measured language designed to soften a verdict that didn't have a soft version. The months of Marcus and physical therapists and specialists and second opinions and third opinions, all of which eventually agreed with the first opinion. And then the slow, terrible process of rebuilding something, not his body, which was beyond rebuilding, but himself, his presence, his authority, his ability to walk into a room that he could no longer walk into and make everyone in it understand that he was still the most dangerous man there. He had done it. He was certain he had done it. But something had been bleeding out of his empire while he was focused on staying alive in it. He saw that now in the clarity that humiliation sometimes brings. While he had been reasserting himself, proving himself working twice as hard to maintain the same ground, someone had been quietly cutting the roots. He sat with that knowledge for a long moment. Then the door opened. It was not a dramatic opening. It did not bang against the wall or swing wide with purpose. It opened about 8 inches slowly, the way a door opens when someone is using it carefully, when someone is not entirely sure they're allowed to be doing what they're doing. Rowan turned his head. In the gap of the door stood a little girl. She was small, even for what he guessed was her age, which he put at somewhere around 5 or 6. Dark hair slightly tangled, pulled into a ponytail that had mostly escaped its band and was hanging loose around her ears. She was wearing a white shirt with a small pink butterfly printed on the front, and her shoes, he noticed the shoes, which were the kind that light up when you step with small red lights along the sole, were slightly too big for her feet, shifting when she moved. She looked at Rowan. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The girl's eyes moved around the room with the frank, comprehensive curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't looking at something. She took in the table the candles, the plates, the cake. Then she looked back at him. "This is a lot of food," she said. "It is," Rowan agreed. She pushed the door open a bit wider and took 2 steps inside, still looking at the table. "Is someone else coming?" Rowan looked at the 30 empty chairs. "No," he said. "I don't think so." She seemed to consider this with the seriousness that children sometimes apply to information they find unusual. Her head tilted slightly to the side. Were they supposed to? They were supposed to, but they didn't come. They didn't come. Another pause. The girl walked 3 more steps into the room, close enough now that he could see her more clearly. She had a small scab on her chin that was starting to heal, and her eyes were dark brown and very direct. She looked at the cake. "Is that a birthday cake?" "It is." "Is it your birthday?" "It is." She looked from the cake back to him. "And nobody came to your birthday?" Rowan didn't answer right away. In 20 years of being one of the most feared men in this city, he had sat across from federal prosecutors and rival bosses and men who wanted him dead and never once flinched. He had looked at worse things than this question and answered without blinking. But something about the way she asked it, with no judgment in it, no pity, just the plain curiosity of a child trying to understand a fact that didn't make sense to her, put him somewhere he hadn't expected to be tonight. "Nobody came," he said. The girl looked at him for another long moment. Then she walked toward the cake. She stood on her tiptoes and looked at the top of it, at the burned-down wax stubs that had once been candles. She looked back at him. "Did you make a wish?" "I didn't light the candles." "You have to light them first. That's how it works." She said this with the authority of someone delivering established fact. "You light them, then you make a wish, then you blow them out. Otherwise it doesn't count." Rowan looked at her. Something was happening in the vicinity of his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. "Is that right?" "Yes." She looked around the table, found something she was looking for, and reached out to pull a small stem with a white flower from the centerpiece arrangement. She climbed up onto the nearest chair without asking, balanced herself on her knees, and leaned forward to place the flower on top of the cake. "There," she said. "That's better." Rowan stared at the flower on the white frosting. "What's your name?" "Piper." "How did you get in here, Piper?" The door wasn't all the way closed. She said this without any indication that she understood it might have been intended to be closed. "I was looking for the bathroom and I saw the food." "Where's your mother?" "Downstairs. She works here." She was looking at the cake again. "If you want, I can find some matches. For the candles. My mom can find matches." "That's all right." "Are you sure? Because you're supposed to make a wish? It's your birthday." She looked at him with those very direct brown eyes. "Don't you want to make a wish?" Rowan opened his mouth to say something he wasn't sure what, and that was when the door flew fully open. The woman who came through it was not what he expected, which was something between surprise and fury. She was young, early 30s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back and the slightly harried look of someone who had been moving fast since morning and hadn't stopped. She was wearing the black and white uniform of the hotel's food service staff, and her expression when she saw her daughter standing on a chair in the middle of a private dining room went through about 4 different emotions in less than 2 seconds. "Piper!" Her voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that came from not wanting to make the situation worse by panicking. "Piper, get down, right now." "Mom, it's right now, please." Piper climbed down from the chair with the unhurried dignity of someone who did not feel she'd done anything wrong. The woman was already crossing the room, hand extended, and she caught Piper's hand and pulled her close, and then turned to Rowan with an expression that was simultaneously apologetic and terrified, and trying very hard not to show the terrified part. "I am so sorry," she said. "I am so incredibly sorry. She was supposed to stay in the staff break room. I checked on her 20 minutes ago. She was watching something on my phone. I don't know how she got up here. I'm so sorry. She didn't bother you, did she? She didn't touch anything." She was speaking quickly, the sentences running together in that particular rhythm of someone who is alarmed but trying to project calm. Rowan looked at her. She was watching him with a wariness she was doing her best to conceal, the kind of wariness that said she knew whose room this was, or at least knew enough to be careful. "She didn't bother me," he said. "She should not have been in here. This is a private event space. I am so sorry. We'll get out of your way right now. She put a flower on my cake." The woman stopped. She looked at the cake, at the small white flower sitting on the frosting. Then she looked at Rowan. Her expression shifted in a way he couldn't entirely read. "I'm sorry," she said again, quieter this time. "Don't be." Rowan looked at the flower. Then he looked at the empty chairs. Then he looked at the woman and her daughter standing in front of him, and something in him made a decision that surprised even himself. "You've been working all day." She blinked. Yes, double shift." "Have you eaten?" Another blink. "I'm sorry." "Have you eaten?" he said again. "You and the girl. Have you eaten tonight?" She looked at the table, at the 30 untouched place settings, at the platters of food that the kitchen had sent up hours ago and that had been sitting covered ever since. She looked back at him. "We're fine," she said carefully. "That wasn't my question." A pause. Piper, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child at a tennis match, looked up at her mother. "I'm hungry, Mom." The woman closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and looked at Rowan with an expression that was complicated pride and exhaustion and a kind of reluctant honesty. "It's been a long day," she said. "Sit down," Rowan said. "I can't." "You're not on duty in this room. There's no one here to report you. And there's enough food on this table to feed all 30 people who were supposed to be here tonight and didn't bother to show up." He heard the edge in his own voice on that last sentence and consciously softened it. "Please, sit down, both of you." Piper didn't wait for her mother's decision. She climbed back up onto the same chair she'd been kneeling on before and folded her hands on the table in front of her with the manner of someone who has been seated at a fancy dinner many times, which she almost certainly had not. The woman looked at her daughter, then at Rowan, then at the chair beside Piper. Something moved across her face, something that looked like the moment when a person decides to stop fighting something and just let it happen. She sat down. "What's your name?" Rowan asked. "Megan," she said. Then after a beat, "Megan Quinn." "Rowan Hale." She nodded once carefully. She knew the name. He could see it in the small shift of her posture, not a flinch, but an adjustment, an awareness landing. She knew who he was, or knew enough, and she had sat down anyway. He found that he respected that. "Megan Quinn," Piper said helpfully, as if providing clarification. "And I'm Piper Quinn. I'm 6. "I know," Rowan said. "You told me." "I didn't actually tell you how old I am." "No," he admitted. "You didn't. I guessed." Piper looked at him with new interest. "You're good at guessing." "Sometimes." Megan had started moving the serving dish closest to her, lifting the cover, and looking at what was inside with an expression she was clearly trying to keep neutral. Under the cover was a roasted chicken in some kind of herb sauce still warm in the insulated serving dish. She set the cover aside and looked at Piper, and some wordless parental communication passed between them, and Piper sat up straighter and stopped swinging her feet. They began to eat. Rowan watched them for a moment, then he pulled a plate toward himself and began to eat too. It was not what he had expected this evening to be. Nothing about it was. But sitting at the head of a table that had been built for 30 people and was occupied by 3 eating food that had been catered for an empire and was being eaten by a mafia boss, a hotel waitress, and a 6-year-old girl with light-up shoes. There was something in it, something he didn't have a word for, something that had been missing from the rooms he usually occupied. Warmth, maybe? The ordinary kind. The kind that didn't have anything to do with power or money, or the careful maintenance of an image built on fear. Piper ate with the serious focus of a hungry child, and then when she had made sufficient progress, looked up at Rowan again. "What did you wish for?" she asked. "I told you. I didn't light the candles." "But if you had," she said, "what would you wish for?" Rowan looked at her. He thought about the 30 empty chairs. He thought about the name of the empire he'd built, and what it had cost him, and what had just happened to it tonight. He thought about a Tuesday evening in November and a sound like a book dropping on hardwood and a 4-minute absence from the world. "I don't know," he said. Piper seemed to find this an unsatisfactory answer. She looked at the cake with the flower on it. "I know what I'd wish for," she said. "What's that?" She thought about it for a moment with great seriousness. "A dog," she said, "and for my mom not to be tired anymore." The room was very quiet. Megan, who had been focused on her plate, looked up at her daughter. Something moved across her face that she clearly wasn't expecting to feel in this moment and in this room, and she looked away quickly. Rowan looked at the flower on the cake. "Those are good wishes," he said. "I think so," Piper agreed. She picked up her fork again. "You should think of yours for next time." Rowan looked at the empty chairs. He looked at the candles that had never been lit, and the flower that had been placed without being asked, and the woman beside him who was still not looking at him, but whose hand had moved quietly to rest on her daughter's back. "I'll think about it," he said. Outside in the corridors of a city that still believed he was untouchable, something was moving. Phones were being turned off, messages were being deleted, accounts were being quietly shifted into configurations that would be very difficult to explain. A war that had been building in silence for the better part of a year was moving into a different phase one where silence would no longer be enough to contain it. Rowan Hale, sitting at the head of an empty table with a flower on his birthday cake, did not know yet exactly how bad it was going to get, but he knew it was coming. He had known for months. He had known the way you know when weather is changing, not from a single cloud, but from the quality of the air itself, from a pressure that builds so gradually you almost don't notice it until the sky breaks. He put down his fork and looked at the room. He looked at Megan Quinn, who was feeding her daughter birthday cake now with the careful, deliberate cheerfulness of a woman who has decided that something good will come out of this evening, regardless of what it cost her to get here. He looked at Piper, who had frosting on her chin, and was completely unbothered by it. He thought about what it meant that these were the two people who had shown up, not the 30 men with their confirmed reservations and their long histories of promises, not the lieutenants and the captains and the men who had sat across from him in rooms like this one and told him in the kind of language that people use when they want you to believe them absolutely that they were loyal, that they were his. Two strangers, a woman who had worked a double shift and hadn't eaten dinner, a child looking for a bathroom who had thought to put a flower on a lonely man's cake. Rowan looked at the flower. He thought I built an empire on the wrong things. And then underneath that thought, quieter and more dangerous and more honest than anything he had allowed himself to think, in a very long time I have to figure out who did this. Because the 30 empty chairs weren't just an insult. They weren't just a sign that loyalty had frayed at the edges. What happened tonight was a message coordinated, deliberate, and sent by someone who had enough reach inside his network to pull 30 confirmations simultaneously. Someone who knew his guest list. Someone who had access to the communication channels that ran through his inner circle. Someone close. He looked at the untouched crystal glasses, the perfect place settings, the burned-down stubs of 38 candles. He looked at all of it with the eyes that had built an empire once and understood with cold clarity that they could do it again. But first, he needed to understand what he was up against. And he needed to do it before whoever had orchestrated tonight decided that empty chairs were only the beginning. The cake sat on the counter of the staff break room on the 3rd floor, what was left of it. 2 slices missing the flour still on top, slightly tilted now from where Piper had adjusted it twice during dinner. Megan had carried it down herself after Rowan had told her in a tone that didn't leave room for argument to take it. "It'll go to waste otherwise," he'd said, and she hadn't had the energy or the nerve to refuse a man like that twice in one evening. That had been 4 days ago. Megan still thought about it. Not constantly, she didn't have the luxury of constantly. Her life ran on a schedule that left very little room for reflection. Up at 5:30 Piper, to her mother's apartment by 6:45, on the subway by 7, at the hotel by 7:45 first shift, starting at 8. If she was lucky, she grabbed a coffee before the breakfast rush hit. If she wasn't, she grabbed it after and drank it cold. She'd been doing this for 11 months, since her mother's first hospitalization, since the medical bills started arriving in envelopes. She began to dread the sight of since the savings account she'd spent 4 years building got eaten through in 6 weeks. She was not lucky very often, but she thought about that room on the 14th floor. She thought about the 30 empty chairs and what they meant to a man like Rowan Hale, who was not a man she should have been in the same room with, who was not a man you sat down to birthday cake with if you had any sense of self-preservation. She'd known his name before she'd known his face. Everyone who worked in this city long enough knew the name. It moved through conversations differently than other names, quieter with more space around it, the way people talk about things they respect and fear in equal measure. She thought about the way he'd looked at Piper when she put the flour on the cake. She couldn't describe it exactly. It wasn't soft exactly. It was more like something cracking open that had been sealed shut for a long time. Something shifting behind the eyes of a man who had spent years making sure nothing shifted in front of anyone. She thought about it, and then she told herself to stop thinking about it, and then she went to check on a table of 8 in the main dining room and forgot about it for 2 hours, which was the best she could do. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Rowan Hale had also not stopped thinking about it. He had spent 4 days running parallel operations that occupied completely separate parts of his mind, which was a skill he'd developed over 20 years of living in a world where showing what you were thinking could get you killed. On the surface, he was doing what he always did, reviewing financials, taking meetings, maintaining the appearance of an empire running smoothly on its usual mechanisms. Marcus drove him to 2 different offices and 1 warehouse, and a lunch with a legitimate attorney who handled the cleaner side of his business holdings. He answered emails. He returned calls. He said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it, and nothing more. Underneath that, he was counting. He was counting backwards through every interaction in the past 8 months, looking for the pattern he now knew was there. The 30 empty chairs had not happened spontaneously. That kind of coordinated silence required planning, required someone inside the network with enough access and enough reach to make 30 separate decisions happen simultaneously, which meant the trail had to start somewhere. A word said in the wrong room, a communication channel that shouldn't have been used, a payment that moved in a direction it wasn't supposed to move. He was counting, and he was building something, and he was doing it quietly enough that nobody around him knew it was happening. Except Finian. Finian Marsh had been Rowan's head of security for 6 years, which in their world was approximately the equivalent of a geological epoch. He was 44 broad-shouldered and so consistently underestimated by everyone who met him that Rowan had long since stopped trying to correct the impression. People looked at Finian and saw a big, quiet man who stood near doors. What he actually was the person Rowan trusted more than anyone alive, a distinction that had been earned not through gestures of loyalty, but through 11 years of small, unglamorous, consistent reliability, showing up exactly when he was supposed to, doing exactly what he said he would do, never once taking advantage of what he knew or what he could access. On the morning of the 5th day after the birthday, Finian came into Rowan's office and closed the door and stood with his back against it. "I've been pulling the call logs," he said, "the ones from the 6 weeks before the dinner." Rowan looked up from his desk. And Finian walked forward and set a printed sheet on the desk. "There's a pattern in the contact sequence. The calls going out to your guest list, 12 of them, were preceded by a separate call from the same number, same time frame, always 2 to 4 days before your personal invitations went out." He paused. "That number roots back to a burner which we can't trace directly, but the cell towers it pinged put it in the financial district every time it was used." Rowan looked at the sheet. He looked at the pattern. Someone was preempting the invitations. Getting there first. Telling people something before your invites arrived. Finian's voice was level. "We don't know what was said, but whatever it was, 12 out of 30 people heard it and still confirmed with you, and then didn't come. 12 people who had looked him in the face or heard his name from Marcus and said, 'Yes, I'll be there,' and then took the money or the threat or whatever was being offered from the other direction and sat at home on his birthday night instead." Rowan set the sheet down. He was quiet for a moment. "The financial district." "Yes." He thought about this. "That narrows it." "It does," Finian said. "Considerably." He didn't say the name. Neither of them said the name. But the financial district and the access to the guest list and the sophistication of what had been done, those 3 things assembled together pointed somewhere specific. Pointed to someone who had been in Rowan's inner circle long enough to understand exactly how it operated. Someone family. Rowan looked out the window and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Keep pulling. I want the financial logs from the last 6 months. Every account, every transfer, every flag that got cleared without a full review." "That'll take time." "Take it." Finian nodded, picked up the sheet and moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The woman from the hotel, the waitress." He said it carefully without emphasis, which was how Finian delivered information he thought mattered. "Her name's Megan Quinn. Single mother, 1 child. She's been working double shifts at the Meridian for 11 months. Her mother is a patient at Mass General Cardiac Issues ongoing treatment." A pause. "She's carrying a significant amount of medical debt." Rowan was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because 2 nights ago she was approached in the hotel parking garage by a man named Sully Dreyer." Another careful pause. "Dreyer works collection for a lender named Pete Cahill. Cahill operates out of Charlestown. He runs high-interest personal loans mostly to people who can't qualify for bank credit." Finian stopped. "Her mother took one, 18 months ago. The terms were not good." Rowan turned this over. "How much?" "The original was $40,000. With what she's paid and what the terms have added, the balance is closer to $78,000. The number sat in the room. "What did Dreyer say to her in the garage?" "He reminded her of the balance," Finian said. "He told her Cahill was losing patience. He told her she had 2 weeks to make a significant payment or there would be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "He wasn't specific." A beat. He didn't have to be. Rowan said nothing for a long moment. His hands were very still on the desk in front of him. "She working tonight. Second shift starts at 4. Keep an eye on Dreyer." His voice had shifted into something that was not quite cold and not quite warm, but was very precise. "If he goes near that hotel again, I want to know about it within 5 minutes." Finian looked at him for a moment. Not challenging, just reading. "Understood," he said and left. Rowan sat in the quiet of his office and thought about a 6-year-old girl with light-up shoes who had put a flower on a birthday cake and asked a simple question that nobody in his world ever asked him. He thought about a woman who had sat down at his table, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd decided to anyway, and who had left that night with a cake she probably fed her daughter for breakfast the next morning because she was working with 11 months of double shifts and a debt that had grown from $40,000 to $78,000, and a mother in the hospital and no margin for anything to go wrong. He pulled out his phone and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back down. He needed to keep his distance. He understood that. Megan Quinn did not need to be inside whatever was building around him right now. Whatever was coming, and something was coming. The pull logs and the pattern and the name he wasn't saying yet were all pointing towards something that was going to get loud before it got quiet. She did not need to be anywhere near it when it arrived. He understood that clearly. He also understood that Pete Cahill was not going to wait for him to finish being careful. That evening in the hotel's main dining room, Megan Quinn was refilling water glasses at a table of 6 when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She ignored it, finished. The table smiled at the guest, who asked whether the sea bass was good tonight, said, "Yes, it's excellent," meant it well enough, and walked back toward the service station. She checked her phone. It was her mother. A text that said, "Someone paid the Cahill account. All of it. I got a call from the lender. They said it was settled. Megan, what did you do?" Megan read the text twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she stood very still next to the water pitchers with her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She hadn't done anything. She had $53 in her checking account and a credit card that was maxed at its limit, and a payment plan with the hospital that she was one missed paycheck away from defaulting on. She had not paid $78,000 to anyone because $78,000 was not a sum she had ever possessed in her entire life. She called her mother back immediately. "Mom, say that again." "The man from the loan company called this afternoon. He said the account had been settled, in full. He said we don't owe them anything." Her mother's voice was shaking slightly. "Megan, I don't understand. Did you borrow money from someone? Are you in trouble?" "No," Megan said. "I'm not in trouble. Give me a few hours." "Okay, I'll call you tonight." She hung up and stood there with the phone in her hand. Her mind went immediately and entirely to one place. She thought, no. She thought, that's not possible. She thought, why would he do that? She thought, I need to not think about why he would do that. She put the phone back in her pocket and went back to work. It took her until the end of her shift, until she was in the locker room pulling off her work shoes and sitting on the bench in the particular exhaustion of someone who has been on their feet for 8 hours, to allow herself to actually sit with what had happened. $78,000. Gone. Settled. An account that had been hanging around her mother's neck, around both their necks, like a weight that got heavier every month, regardless of how hard she swam. She wasn't naive. She knew how that kind of money got moved and by whom and at what cost. She knew that things that came from people like Rowan Hale did not come without a shape to them, without an expectation attached on the other side. She had been raised by a woman who had spent her whole life working for what she had, and who had instilled in her daughters a particular allergy to obligation, to being owed, to being in the kind of debt that couldn't be repaid with money. But she also knew that a man who was going to use a kindness against you didn't usually do it quietly in the middle of the night without telling you. People who wanted leverage announced it. They made sure you knew what you owed them, so you felt it every time you looked at them. Rowan Hale had not said a word. She thought about going up to the 14th floor. She thought about finding Marcus, whose name she'd been told by one of the senior staff weeks ago, and leaving a message. She thought about writing something and leaving it at the front desk. She thought about all of these things and sat on the bench in the locker room and did none of them because she didn't know what to say, and because part of her understood in a way she wasn't entirely comfortable with that whatever had just happened was not a transaction. It wasn't a gesture designed to require something from her. It was just a thing that had been done quietly by a man who had learned her situation and done something about it. She wasn't used to that. She wasn't used to it at all. What she didn't know, sitting in that locker room, was that Sully Dreher had tried to visit the hotel parking garage again that evening, 2 hours into her shift. He hadn't made it to the garage. She didn't need to know that part. Rowan had been very specific about that. 2 days later, Piper caught a stomach bug. It was the ordinary, unglamorous kind that goes through elementary schools in waves, 24 hours of misery, then recovery, then the next child in the class going down. Megan got the call from the school nurse at 10:15 in the morning in the middle of the breakfast service and spent 3 minutes making arrangements with the other staff and 20 minutes on the subway, and walked into the nurse's office to find Piper sitting on a cot, looking pale and slightly indignant. "I only threw up once," Piper said by way of greeting. "I think I'm fine." "You're not fine," Megan said, and put the back of her hand against her daughter's forehead, the way her own mother had done, the gesture so automatic and so old, it lived in the hands before it lived in the mind. "You have a fever. It's a small fever. There's no such thing as a small fever when you're 6. She picked up the bag the nurse had packed with Piper's things. "Come on, arms up." Piper went up. She was heavier than she used to be, always growing every 3 months. Megan noticed it again, as if for the first time, and she wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and pressed her face into the side of her hair. "Mom," she said muffled. Is the birthday man okay?" Megan paused mid-step. "What? The man from the birthday, the one in the wheelchair." Piper pulled back slightly to look at her mother. "Is he okay? He seemed sad." Megan looked at her daughter's face, pale, slightly glassy with fever, completely sincere. 6 years old, and she'd spent 4 days thinking about whether a man she'd met once for an hour was okay. Megan thought about the $78,000. She thought about the quiet in the parking garage. She thought about the way Rowan Hale had looked at the flower on the cake. "I think he's okay," she said. "We should visit him." Piper. He was by himself, she said with the particular insistence of a child who has decided something is true and will not be dissuaded by adult logic. "People shouldn't be by themselves on their birthdays. We should check on him. We barely know him. We ate his cake." That doesn't mean." Megan shifted her daughter's weight and started walking again. "Let's get you home first. We can talk about it when you're feeling better." "Okay," Piper said easily, which meant she had already decided and was simply waiting for circumstances to catch up. They went home. Piper slept most of the afternoon and ate half a piece of toast and drank ginger ale and watched 2 episodes of a nature show about otters that she had already seen 4 times. By 6 o'clock, her fever had broken, and she was sitting up and interested in the world again, which was its own particular relief, the specific exhale of a parent when the color comes back to a sick child's face. Megan made soup, the kind from a can that her own mother had made for her, and sat at the kitchen table while Piper ate and talked about otters at length. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something she wouldn't be able to say what made her answer. "Ms. Quinn." The voice was Marcus. She recognized it from the hotel. "I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Hale. He asks if your daughter is recovering well." Megan sat completely still for a moment. How did he know she was sick? A brief pause. "The hotel has a staff communication system. He was informed you'd had to leave your shift." She processed this. It was not entirely a satisfying explanation. "She's fine," she said. "The fever broke. She's eating." "I'm glad to hear it." Another pause. "Mr. Hale also wanted me to convey regarding the other matter that nothing is expected in return. He wanted to be clear about that." Megan looked at the ceiling. She looked at Piper, who was eating soup and watching her with those very attentive eyes that missed nothing. "Tell him," she said carefully, "that I appreciate it and that I don't know how to say the right thing about something like that." "I'll tell him exactly that," Marcus said. "Good evening, Miss Quinn." He hung up. Megan put the phone down on the table. Piper was still watching her. "Who was that? Someone from work. Was it the birthday man?" Megan looked at her daughter. "Go back to your soup." "Mom." "Soup Piper." Piper went back to her soup, but she was smiling, and Megan saw it, and she looked away before her daughter could see that she was working very hard to keep her own expression in the appropriate category of neutral. 3 days after that, Megan was back at work and trying to put the whole situation into some kind of manageable box in her head when one of the senior banquet staff told her in a tone of confidential excitement that Mr. Hale had made a dinner reservation. A private one. Not the 14th floor this time, the rooftop terrace, a smaller space, more informal. "Just him," the senior staff said, "and he specifically requested you for the service." Megan blinked. "He requested me. By name." The woman gave her a look that contained approximately 11 different implications, none of which Megan appreciated. "Lucky you." Lucky was one word for it. She spent the better part of her afternoon deciding what she was going to say, and by the time 7 o'clock came and she was taking the service elevator to the rooftop terrace with a water pitcher and a menu she already had memorized, she had decided on something simple and honest. She would thank him. She would mean it. She would make clear that she understood the terms which were no terms, and she would do her job professionally and go home. She stepped out onto the terrace and found Rowan Hale sitting at a small table near the railing, looking out at the city, and she stood for a moment just taking in the fact of him, without the framework of the birthday room around him. He looked different here. Not smaller, he wasn't a man who looked smaller in any context, but more ordinary. Present. Like a person, rather than a reputation. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Ms. Quinn?" "Mr. Hale." She set the water down and poured his glass. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. "The kitchen has a tasting menu tonight, if you'd like to hear it." "In a moment." He looked at her. "How's Piper?" "She's at my mother's, completely recovered, talking about otters." Something shifted in his expression. "Otters?" She saw a documentary. "We're in the educational phase. It'll be sharks in about 2 weeks." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Sit down." "I'm working." "I know. Sit down anyway." She sat. She set the water pitcher on the table and folded her hands and looked at him directly because she'd decided that was the approach. Direct, equal, not deferential, not confrontational, just honest. "The account," she said. "Yes. You didn't have to do that." "I know. I'm not going to pretend I know how to square something like that. I've spent 3 days trying to figure out what you're supposed to say to someone who does something like that, and I haven't come up with anything that doesn't sound completely inadequate." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to say anything." "That's what Marcus said." "Marcus is right. It's a lot of money," she said, "for a stranger." He looked at her. Piper put a flower on my birthday cake. The sentence sat between them simply. Megan looked at the table. She felt something in her chest doing the complicated thing again, the same thing it had done in the locker room. She'd been working since she was 16 years old. She'd learned early and without bitterness that the world did not give out what it did not receive. That kindness was a transaction most of the time, and a surprise occasionally, and that the appropriate response to a surprise was gratitude followed by caution. She was grateful. She was also, despite herself, not feeling the caution she knew she should be feeling. "I'm going to pay you back," she said. "I don't know when. I don't know how long it'll take. But I'm going to." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes. "I want to." "That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did the shifting thing again, the thing she'd seen in the birthday room, the crack opening in something that had been sealed. "All right," he said, "if that's what you want." "It is." A pause, then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "The birthday, the empty room." She said it carefully. "Has anyone explained it to you? Why nobody came?" His expression changed in a way that was very subtle and told her something precise. She had stepped somewhere real. "Not yet," he said, "but you know something." "I know some things." She looked at him. He looked like a man carrying something he'd been carrying alone for a long time, not bent under it, because he was not the kind of man who bent, but aware of the weight, aware of it in every carefully controlled line of his posture. "I'm sorry," she said, "that nobody came." He said nothing for a moment. Then, 30 people and I built something with all of them. Years, favors, money, time, and your daughter was the one who showed up with a flower. "She doesn't have much of a filter," Megan said. "She just sees what's in front of her." "I know." He looked out at the city. "I used to think that was a disadvantage." And now, he turned back to her. For a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a 38-year-old man who had spent too long surrounded by people who wanted something from him, sitting across from someone who didn't, and not quite knowing what to do with that. "Now I'm less sure," he said. Megan poured his water again, even though it didn't need pouring, just to have something to do with her hands. Then she picked up the menu. "The tasting menu," she said. "The first course is a seared scallop with cauliflower puree. The kitchen does it well." "Then I'll have that," he said. She stood up. She was almost to the service entrance when he spoke again. "Ms. Quinn?" She turned. "Your daughter's invitation stands, if she wants to visit." He said it without weight, without agenda, just as a plain statement of fact. "She can come. I don't have a dog for her, but I have a better birthday cake than that one was." Megan looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll tell her. She'll say yes immediately, and you should know that before you offer." "I figured," he said. She went back inside. In the elevator going down, she leaned against the wall and let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 2 weeks. Below the hotel in the city that believed it understood Rowan Hale, things were moving that he was only beginning to map. Financial accounts shifting in configurations that would take months to fully untangle. A name in the financial district on a burner phone connected to 30 broken promises. A pattern in the call logs that Finian had been staring at for 5 days, and that was starting to assemble itself into a picture none of them wanted to see. The picture had a face in it. Rowan didn't know yet, not with certainty. He was still counting, still building the case with the patience of a man who understood that acting before the evidence was complete was the only mistake that couldn't be corrected. He had learned this over 20 years in a world where the wrong conclusion drawn too early cost people everything. He was being careful. But in his chest, in the place where the counted evidence was accumulating, the name was already there. Had been there probably for longer than he'd let himself admit. The way some truths arrive, not as a revelation, but as a recognition. Not as something new, but as something you'd known and hadn't allowed yourself to know. He sat on the rooftop terrace in the evening air and looked out at Boston and thought about his cousin. He thought about the face of a man he'd grown up beside, a man who'd sat at his table for 20 years and learned everything there was to know about how Rowan Hale operated. A man with access to guest lists and communication channels and financial structures and the kind of intimate knowledge of the empire's architecture that could only come from having been trusted with it completely. A man who had smiled at him across a dozen dinners and said with the warmth of family how good it was that they had each other. Rowan looked at the city. The candles on his birthday cake had never been lit. The wish had never been made. But something had started in that room that Rowan hadn't expected. Something small and ordinary and completely outside the categories in which he'd organized his life. A flower on a cake. A child's question asked without fear. A woman who sat down because she'd decided to even knowing who he was. He didn't know yet what to do with it. He didn't know how to hold something that simple without it getting broken by the world he lived in. But he knew it had happened. And underneath everything else, underneath the counting and the planning and the gathering of evidence and the name he wasn't saying out loud yet, he held it carefully, like a flower, like something that could still be lost. Piper came on a Saturday. Megan had spent the entire Friday evening telling herself she wasn't going to allow it running through all the reasonable arguments in her head while she made dinner and helped with a worksheet about addition and listened to another 15 minutes of otter facts. She knew who Rowan Hale was. She knew what his world looked like from the outside, and she had enough imagination to guess what it looked like from the inside. She knew that the right thing, the sensible, protective, motherly thing, was to keep her daughter away from all of it. And then Piper had looked up from her worksheet and said very simply, "Mom, we said we'd check on him." And Megan had looked at her daughter's face and understood that she had already lost this particular argument 3 days ago without knowing it. So they went on Saturday. Marcus met them in the lobby. He was exactly as Megan remembered him. Precise quiet with the kind of professional composure that never quite concealed the fact that he was paying attention to everything. He shook Megan's hand and looked down at Piper with a seriousness that Piper immediately matched, extending her own hand in return. "I'm Piper Quinn," she said. "I'm 6. "I know," Marcus said. "Mr. Hale mentioned you." Piper looked extremely satisfied by this. They took the elevator to the 12th floor, not the 14th, Rowan Marcus explained briefly. Kept a private suite in the hotel for days when he had back-to-back meetings in the building. It was easier than commuting. Megan understood this to mean something more complicated than convenience, but didn't ask. She was managing her own nerves with the same system she used for everything: forward momentum, one step at a time. Don't stop moving, or you'll think too hard about it. Marcus knocked twice and opened the door, and Piper walked in first. Rowan was at a table near the window, a cup of coffee in front of him, and a folder open that he closed when they entered. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, and he looked somehow more like a person than he had in either of the previous 2 times she'd seen him. Less composed, less armored. She noticed he'd been working, really working, not performing it, because there was a second coffee cup that had gone cold and a pen that had been set down mid-sentence. Piper walked up to him with the directness that was simply her nature, as if the distance between the door and his chair was a formality she was happy to dispense with. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Rowan said. "Are you better?" He looked at her. "Better than what? Than before? You seemed sad before. At the birthday." Rowan was quiet for a second. Megan watched his face do the thing she'd seen it do twice now. The small, controlled shift, the thing that moved behind his eyes when Piper said something that landed somewhere he wasn't expecting. "A little better," he said. Piper considered this. "Good. Do you have the cake?" "I have a different cake. Better than that one." Her eyes lit up. "What kind?" "Chocolate, with actual frosting, not the white kind." "The white kind is okay," Piper said diplomatically, "but chocolate is better." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and put her hands on the table, and just like that, as naturally as breathing, she was simply there, occupying his space, making herself at home in the life of a man that grown adults were careful to give wide berth. Megan sat in the chair beside her daughter and put her hands in her lap and thought, this child is going to either save the world or cause considerable chaos, and she genuinely could not predict which. What followed was something she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely explain afterward. They talked. Not politely, not in the careful, surface-level way that adults talk when they're in an unfamiliar room with an unfamiliar person, but actually talked the way people talk when something has already been established between them. Piper led most of it, with the unself-conscious authority of someone who considers conversation a basic right. She told Rowan about the Otter documentary, and about her teacher, Mrs. Ramos, who was nice but gave too much homework, and about the girl at school named Sophia, who had a lunchbox shaped like a pineapple, and that Piper found this impressive and planned to ask for one for her birthday. Rowan listened to all of it, not with the patient tolerance of an adult enduring a child's monologue, but with genuine attention, asking questions at the right moments. What kind of otters? Why pineapples specifically? How much was too much homework in Piper's considered opinion? And Piper answered each one with the seriousness of a subject matter expert being properly consulted. Megan watched them and felt something in her chest doing the complicated thing again, but quieter this time. Less alarming. More like something settling. Marcus brought the chocolate cake at 10:30. Piper examined it with the focused attention of a professional. "It's very good," she announced after the first bite. "You should put a flower on it, though." "I don't have a flower," Rowan said. Piper looked around, spotted the small potted plant on the windowsill that was part of the hotel's standard suite decor, and looked back at him. "That one has a leaf." "A leaf isn't a flower. It's close." "It really isn't." "Okay, but you should still put it on there, for decoration." Rowan looked at the plant, then he looked at Piper. Then, without saying anything, he reached over and plucked a small leaf from the plant and set it on top of the cake with the same exact care that Piper had used with the flower 12 days ago. Piper beamed. "Good. Now make a wish." "I thought there had to be candles." "I said that before, but I changed my mind. I think the wish is the important part." Megan watched Rowan Hale close his eyes for approximately 3 seconds. She watched the man who had built an empire on fear and controlled port operations and shipping routes and underground financial networks close his eyes at the request of a 6-year-old girl and make a wish over a chocolate cake with a leaf on top of it. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Piper and said, "Done. What did you wish for?" "You can't tell. It won't come true." Piper thought about this very seriously. "Okay," she said, accepting the rule. "Mine still would have been a dog, and for my mom not to be tired." "I remember," Rowan said. Piper looked at him with the sudden laser focus she applied to things she'd just decided mattered. "You remembered?" "I did. That was like 2 weeks ago." "I know." She tilted her head. "Most grown-ups don't remember what I say that long." Rowan looked at her steadily. "I'm paying attention," he said, and his voice was entirely sincere, and Megan had to look at the table for a moment because the expression on her daughter's face was one she didn't want anyone to see her responding to in the way she was responding to it. They stayed 2 hours. 2 hours that moved the way time moves when something is good too quickly without warning, so that when Marcus appeared in the doorway and said quietly that Mr. Hale had a call in 30 minutes, Megan was genuinely surprised that it was already past noon. She stood and started gathering Piper's jacket, and Piper slid off the chair and went to Rowan and without preamble hugged him. Just walked up and put her arms around as much of him as she could reach and pressed her face against his shoulder. Megan froze. Rowan froze. He sat very still for a moment. Then slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile, he put one hand on the back of Piper's head. Piper pulled back and looked at him with complete satisfaction. "We'll come back," she said. This was not a question. "Okay," Rowan said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Maybe next time you'll have a flower." "I'll look into it." In the elevator going down, Piper held Megan's hand and hummed something tuneless and content. Megan looked at the elevator doors and thought about the look on Rowan Hale's face when a 6-year-old girl had hugged him. She thought about a man who could make 30 people disappear from a guest list with fear and who had sat completely still under the arms of a child, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched by something that didn't want anything from him. She thought, "I am in serious trouble." Then she thought, "I think he might be too." Then the elevator opened, and she decided firmly to table this entire line of thinking until further notice. They came back 2 weeks later. And 2 weeks after that. It became, without any formal agreement, a thing that happened. Saturday mornings, sometimes Sunday afternoons. Piper progressed from otters to sharks to inexplicably medieval siege weapons, which led to a 40-minute conversation with Rowan about trebuchets that Megan found equally baffling and oddly moving. Rowan, it turned out, knew a surprisingly large amount about medieval history. Piper found this excellent. She had decided somewhere around the third visit that Rowan was her friend, and she applied this designation with the full commitment that she applied to everything. Megan found herself talking too, not just listening while Piper held court, but actually contributing about the hotel, about her mother's recovery, which was slow but real, about the apartment and the things she was slowly paying down now that the debt that had been strangling her for 18 months was gone. She found that Rowan listened the way he'd listened to Piper, with full attention, without interrupting, without offering solutions unless she asked for them. She was not used to that. The men in her life had mostly been the kind who heard a problem as an opportunity to demonstrate their problem-solving capabilities. Rowan just listened. She found herself saying things she hadn't planned to say, about how tired she'd been for so long that she'd forgotten what not tired felt like, about how she'd trained herself to stop wanting things she couldn't afford to want, because wanting them just made the gap feel bigger. About Piper's father briefly, and without drama, he'd left when Piper was 8 months old, and Megan had spent a year being angry about it, and 3 years getting over being angry, and was now mostly just indifferent, which she'd been told was the healthy end state. Rowan had listened to all of it, and then he'd said, "She's remarkable. You did that." Megan had looked at him. "Piper's remarkable because she's Piper. She's Piper because of how you raised her." He said it without sentimentality, just as a factual observation. "I've met a lot of people. I know what it looks like when a child has been shown how to be in the world. She has that." Megan didn't know what to say to that. She'd looked at the window, she'd felt the complicated thing in her chest doing what it did, and she'd decided that she was not going to examine it too carefully right now, and had changed the subject back to trebuchets. But she'd carried it home with her. She carried a lot of things home from those Saturday mornings that she didn't examine too carefully. Finian noticed. He didn't say anything. Finian rarely said anything that wasn't strictly necessary, but Rowan caught him watching sometimes, with the particular expression of a man doing a calculation, not disapproving, just calculating. On a Thursday morning in the 5th week, Finian came into the office and closed the door and stood with his back against it, and his face told Rowan before he said a word that something had moved. "Tell me," Rowan said. Finian set a folder on the desk. "The financial logs, 6 months of transfers." He opened it to a page with a series of account numbers and highlighted lines. "There's a pattern that emerges around month 4, a series of small transfers individually below the threshold that triggers review moving out of the secondary operating accounts through a series of shells. I traced 4 of them before the trail splits into foreign accounts." He paused. "The originating point on all 4 is the same account." Rowan looked at the account number. He recognized the first 6 digits. He would have. He'd helped set up the account structure himself years ago when the empire was being built, and everything had been organized with obsessive care. That account belonged to Garrett Hale. Rowan sat very still. "How much?" he said. "In the period I can document clearly approximately 2.3 million, but the pattern suggests it's been running longer than what I can trace with the logs I have. If it started earlier," Finian's jaw tightened slightly, "potentially significantly more. 2.3 million. Moving in careful below-threshold increments through shells that someone had constructed with knowledge of exactly how the review system worked, with knowledge that could only come from having been inside the room when the review system was designed. Garrett had been in that room. Garrett had been in every room." Rowan looked at the account number for a long time. He thought about his cousin's face, the easy smile, the family warmth, the particular way Garrett had of making you feel that your trust in him was well placed because he'd worked so hard to earn it. He thought about the dinners and the meetings and the years of being told in the language of blood and loyalty that they were in this together. He thought about a burner phone pinging towers in the financial district 2 to 4 days before every one of his birthday invitations went out. "There's more," Finian said. Rowan looked up. Finian opened another page in the folder. "I went back further, 18 months back." He set his finger on a line near the bottom of the page. "There's a payment, large, not from Garrett's accounts directly routed through 3 additional shells, but it terminates in an account that we've previously connected to a man named Vasquez, Luis Vasquez." The name landed in the room like something physical. Megan had asked him about the birthday and whether he knew why nobody came, and he had said, "I know some things." He had not told her about Vasquez. He had not told her about the November night and the parking lot and the sound like a book falling on hardwood. He had not told her because it wasn't something he talked about, and because some truths were not for the spaces that were still clean. Luis Vasquez was the man who had shot him. Vasquez had been caught 6 months after the shooting, picked up on an unrelated charge, and had died in federal custody before trial in circumstances that Rowan had never fully investigated, because there had been a period in his recovery when he was more focused on staying alive than understanding how he'd nearly died. But the payment, 18 months ago, routed through 3 shells to an account connected to the man who had put him in this wheelchair. Rowan looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. "Garrett," he said. Not a question. Just the name spoken quietly, in the voice people use when they're saying something they can't take back. "The connection isn't direct enough yet to be actionable," Finian said carefully, "but it's consistent with everything else." "He paid for it," Rowan said. "He paid for the shooting." Finian was quiet. "He's been planning this for at least 18 months. The shooting first get me in the chair, compromise my authority, start the clock on my credibility. Then the financial bleed. Then the coordination of the birthday." Rowan's voice was absolutely level. He was doing the thing he'd learned to do at 22 and had never stopped putting the feeling somewhere else while the thinking happened. The feeling would be there afterward. It would be there for a long time. But right now, there was work to do. He wanted me to fall apart. He wanted me to see 30 empty chairs and break. "He may not have anticipated your recovery," Finian said. "After the shooting, medically the expectation was, I know what the expectation was." Rowan looked at the window. He thought the chair would finish what the bullet didn't. The room was very quiet. Then Rowan said, "I need more. I need the connection to the shooting documented, and I need to know who else is involved, not just the 30 from the birthday, but who knew and helped plan it. Garrett didn't do this alone. He doesn't have the reach." "I'll keep pulling," Finian said. "And Finian." Rowan looked at him. "Nothing moves, not yet. We do this right or we don't do it." "Understood." Finian picked up the folder. Then he paused. "Mr. Hale." He said it in the specific way that meant what he was about to say was outside the normal category of their conversation. "The woman and the girl, the Quinns." Rowan looked at him. "If Garrett knows about them—" "He doesn't," Rowan said. "If he finds out, he won't." Rowan's voice was very quiet. "I've been careful." Finian looked at him for a moment, then he nodded once and left. Rowan sat in the office and looked at the window and thought about careful. He had been careful. He had kept the Saturday visits quiet. Marcus was trusted absolutely, and no one else in the operation knew about Megan Quinn and her daughter. He had cleared the debt without creating a trail that led back to her. He had handled Dreyer without involving anyone who might talk. He had been careful. But careful had limits, and he was starting to understand that the situation he was in, a cousin who had paid for his shooting and spent 18 months building toward an overthrow, was not a situation in which the people around him could be entirely protected by his carefulness alone. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again. He called Marcus. "The Quinns," he said when Marcus answered. "Discreet additional security. Starting today. She doesn't need to know about it." A pause. "Of course," Marcus said. "And Marcus." Rowan stopped. "Nothing about what we're doing right now. She doesn't hear any of it." "Understood, sir." He hung up. He sat for a long moment with the phone in his hand and thought about what it meant to want to keep someone clean from the world you'd built. He'd never wanted that before. He'd never had a reason to. Everyone in his life had either been part of the machinery or far enough outside it that there was no point of contact. Megan Quinn was standing exactly at the edge of that boundary, and he was the one who had put her there, and he didn't know yet what to do about that, except keep her on the right side of it for as long as he possibly could. The following Saturday, Piper arrived with a book about sharks that she had checked out from the school library specifically to show him. She sat down and opened it to a page showing a great white and began explaining bite force in pounds per square inch with the authority of a small professor. Rowan listened with his full attention and asked 3 genuine questions and told her the one thing he actually knew about great whites, which was that they were older as a species than trees, and watched her face go completely still with the particular amazement that only children can produce, total unguarded, as if the world had just expanded. "That's not real," she said. "It is. Trees are really old. Sharks are older." Piper looked at the book. She looked at Rowan. She looked at the book again. "I have to tell Sophia," she said, with the urgency of someone who has just received information too important to keep. "Tell her at school Monday." "She won't believe me." "Then show her the book." Piper thought about this. Then she nodded decisively and turned to the next page. Megan beside her was watching Rowan with an expression she hadn't bothered to compose this time. He caught her eye. She looked away, then back. "You're good with her," she said quietly under Piper's narration about hammerheads. He said nothing for a moment. "I'm not used to it." "You could have fooled me." "I've been paying attention," he said. "Like I said." She looked at him steadily. "Rowan." It was the first time she'd used his name without Mr. attached to the front of it, and they both noticed it. "Whatever's going on with you right now, and I know something is, I can see it. Are you okay?" He considered lying. It would have been easy. He was very good at it, or had been for a long time. But he looked at her face, which was asking the question with the same directness her daughter used for everything, and understood that lying to Megan Quinn was something he didn't want to do. "Not entirely," he said. She nodded. She didn't ask for more than that. She just nodded, which was he was learning her way of saying, "I see you and I'm not going anywhere." He thought about Finian's question, if Garrett knows about them. He thought about the $2.3 million in documented transfers and the payment to Vasquez and the 30 empty chairs and the 18 months of planning. He thought about a man who had sat at his table for 20 years and smiled with the warmth of family. And underneath all of it, underneath the cold and careful architecture of what he was building in Finian's office with the financial logs and the call records and the documented shell accounts underneath, all of that sitting in a room with a woman who had looked at him and asked if he was okay and waited for a real answer, he felt something shift. Not breaking. Not falling. Something harder than that and quieter. The beginning of a decision. He had built an empire on fear and held it together with the belief that loyalty could be purchased and maintained if the price was right. Garrett had proven in the most personal way possible that this was wrong, that everything built on that foundation was eventually available to the highest bidder. But something else existed. He was sitting across from it right now, something that didn't have a price on it because it had never been offered for sale. Something that had walked into his birthday room without knowing who he was and put a flower on his cake because a child had seen a lonely man and done the thing that felt right. He thought, "I don't know how to hold this without breaking it." He thought, "I have to figure it out anyway." Piper closed the shark book and looked up. "Mom," she said, "can we get pizza on the way home?" Megan looked at her daughter. "Maybe." "Rowan, do you like pizza?" Piper asked. He looked at this child who called him by his first name as if it had never occurred to her to do anything else. "I do," he said. "You should come with us sometime," she said. "They have really good pizza. It's not fancy like here, but it's better." Rowan looked at Piper. He looked at Megan, who was watching him with the expression she got when her daughter said something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure whether to qualify. He looked at the two of them, this small, improbable pair who had walked into the emptiest night of his life and somehow made it the beginning of something instead of the end. "I'd like that," he said, and he meant it in a way that surprised him. Quietly and completely and without reservation, the way you mean things when you've stopped performing and started telling the truth. Outside in the corridors of the city, Finian was pulling logs. Shell accounts were being traced, a pattern connecting a cousin and a shooting, and 18 months of quiet betrayal was assembling itself with the patience of a man who understood that the truth had to be built like anything else worth having, carefully piece by piece without cutting corners. The war was still coming. Nothing about that had changed. But for 2 hours on a Saturday morning in a hotel suite with chocolate cake and a shark book and a 6-year-old who had decided that a Mafia boss was her friend Rowan Hale sat in the warmth of something he hadn't known he was missing. He held it carefully. He was getting better at that. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 6:52, which was how Rowan would always remember it afterward, not by date, not by month, but by the specific time, because he had been awake since 5 and had been sitting with his coffee going cold and his mind running the same calculations. It had been running for 3 weeks, and when the phone rang and he saw Finian's name on the screen, he knew before he answered that something had moved. "Tell me," he said. Finian's voice was controlled in the way it got when the news was bad enough to require extra steadiness. "I found the third shell account, the one that funded the Vasquez payment." A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "It traces back to a holding company registered in Delaware. The company was dissolved 8 months after the shooting, but I pulled the incorporation documents." Another pause. "The registered agent is a man named Paul Dreiss. Dreiss is a lawyer who has done incorporation work for your family for 23 years. Rowan set down his coffee cup. "Garrett used the family attorney. He used him specifically because the name would never trigger a review in your financial monitoring system. Dreiss's firm appears in dozens of legitimate Hale transactions. He was camouflage." The coldness of it settled over Rowan like something physical. Not just the betrayal he had been living with, the shape of the betrayal for weeks now, turning it over, mapping its dimensions. What hit him now was the patience of it, the years of it. Garrett had not done this in a moment of anger or opportunity. He had planned it with the kind of deliberate, layered construction that took months of preparation. He had used a trusted family lawyer as cover. He had waited for exactly the right moment, the shooting the chair, the slow erosion of Rowan's visible authority, and then he had started pulling threads. "How complete is the documentation?" Rowan asked. "The Vasquez payment is documented. The $2.3 million in transfers is documented. The burner phone and the cell tower records are documented. The preempted guest list calls—" Finian stopped. "Rowan, it's enough. It's more than enough. If you take this to the council today, Garrett is finished." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Not yet." "What are you waiting for?" "I want the full picture, not just what he took. I want to know who else was in the room when he planned it. I want every name, every account, every conversation that can be documented." His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "When I bring this to the council, I want it to be the last conversation anyone ever has to have about Garrett Hale." Finian was silent for a beat. "That'll take another week, maybe 2. Take it." He hung up and sat in the early morning quiet and let himself feel for exactly 60 seconds what he had been not feeling for 3 weeks. The full weight of it. The specific grief of a particular kind of betrayal, not the kind that comes from strangers, which was painful but comprehensible, but the kind that comes from someone you grew up with, someone who had been at your mother's funeral, someone who had sat beside you in a hospital room 3 months after the shooting and held your hand and said with tears in his eyes, "We'll find whoever did this, Rowan. I promise you that." 60 seconds. Then he put it away. There was work to do. What he didn't know, what none of his careful preparations had accounted for, was that something had already moved on the other side of the board. Garrett Hale had been watching, not with the direct documented surveillance that Rowan and Finian were building their case on. With something older and more instinctive, the awareness of a man who has spent years inside a machinery he is now trying to dismantle, and who has learned to read the machine's sounds the way a mechanic reads an engine. Garrett knew what Rowan sounded like when things were normal. He knew what his cousin's operational patterns looked like, the rhythm of his meetings, the frequency of his communications with specific people. And in the past 6 weeks, something in that rhythm had changed. Finian was spending more time in the financial records. Rowan was canceling non-essential meetings without explanation. Marcus had rerouted 2 logistics calls through different channels without explanation. Small things, individually meaningless. But Garrett had spent 20 years learning to read small things. He sat in his office on the 11th floor of a building in the financial district, the same building whose cell towers had pinged the burner phone Finian had traced, and understood that the window he had was closing. He had planned for this possibility. He had contingencies built in. What he had not entirely planned for was the speed of Rowan's recovery, the fact that a man who should have been broken by 30 empty chairs and 3 years in a wheelchair was somehow more dangerous than he had been before. Garrett picked up his phone and made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes, At the end of it, he hung up and looked at his desk and made a decision that crossed a line he hadn't crossed yet. The line between undermining and ending. Megan found out about none of this on Tuesday or Wednesday. On Thursday, she picked Piper up from school, and they went to the grocery store, and she bought pasta and the specific kind of tomato sauce that Piper accepted without negotiation. And they went home and made dinner, and Piper did homework, and Megan paid 2 bills online and went to bed at 10:30. On Friday morning, she was halfway through her first shift when one of the other servers touched her arm near the service station and said quietly, "There's a man in the lobby asking for you. Not a guest. He said it was personal." Megan went to the lobby. The man was nobody she recognized. 40s nondescript jacket standing near the entrance with this specific quality of stillness that she had learned in the past 2 months to associate with the kind of men who worked in the orbit of Rowan's world. Not threatening exactly, just very present. "Ms. Quinn," he said. He didn't offer his name. "I work for Mr. Hale. He asked me to let you know that your daughter and your mother are safe and accounted for and that you should continue your shift as normal." Megan stared at him. "What? They're safe," he repeated. "Your mother is at her apartment. Your daughter is at school. Both locations are being monitored." "Why would they need to be monitored?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her because her heart was doing something very unsteady. "What's happening?" The man looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "Mr. Hale will contact you directly. He asked that you please stay in the hotel for the remainder of your shift." He left. Megan stood in the lobby for approximately 30 seconds, and then she walked to the back stairwell because it was empty, and she stood in it and breathed and made herself think instead of panic. Something was wrong. Something big enough that Rowan had put eyes on her daughter and her mother before telling her about it. That was the sequence protection first information, second, and the sequence itself told her something about what she was dealing with. She called Rowan's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. "Marcus," she said, "tell me what's happening." "Ms. Quinn." He sounded careful and slightly strained. "Mr. Hale is in a meeting. He'll call you within the hour." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "There have been some developments in a situation Mr. Hale is managing. As a precaution, he's arranged security for you and your family. There's nothing to be alarmed about." "There's security on my 6-year-old daughter," Megan said. "That is by definition something to be alarmed about." Another pause. "I understand that. He'll explain everything when he calls. Please stay in the hotel." She hung up. She stood in the stairwell for another minute. Then she went back to work because there was nothing else to do, and because panic was not something she could afford in the middle of a shift, and because the only information she had right now was that Piper was safe, and she held that fact like a handhold on something that was moving under her feet. Rowan called at 11:43. She took it in the break room, which was empty. "Talk to me," she said before he could say anything else. "Megan." His voice was different. Not the controlled warmth of their Saturday mornings. The other voice, the level, precise voice she had heard once before across the banquet room when she had overheard him speaking to someone she couldn't see about something she hadn't understood. The voice that belonged to the other version of him, the one who ran ports and shipping routes and underground financial networks. "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I've been in a situation since early this morning." "Rowan, what is happening?" A short pause. "There's someone I've been investigating for the past 6 weeks who may have become aware that I'm moving against him. We believe he's taking steps in response." His voice was measured. "I'm being careful. Your family is covered. You're in the safest location you could be right now." "Is this about the birthday?" she asked. "The empty chairs." Another pause. "Yes." "Is it someone close to you?" The pause this time was longer. "Yes." Megan closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the past 6 weeks. She thought about his face on those Saturday mornings, the warmth underneath the control, the way he'd been getting more careful about certain things, the phone calls he took outside the room, the slight tension she'd noticed building in the way Marcus moved around him. She'd seen it accumulating. She'd told herself it wasn't her business. She'd told herself she was imagining it. She hadn't been imagining it. "Are you safe?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him somewhere. I'm taking precautions. That's not what I asked. A beat. I'm working on it. She opened her eyes. Rowan, I need you to tell me straight. Is my daughter in danger because of me, because of us coming to see you? No. His voice was immediate and absolutely certain. No. Whatever he knows, and we don't believe he knows much, it has nothing to do with you. This is between him and me and has been for a long time. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, not because you're involved. She thought about this. But you put security on them. As a precaution, because I have the ability to, and because it costs me nothing, and it means you don't have to worry while you're at work. A pause. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out this way. I wanted to tell you tonight. Megan sat with that for a moment. She sat with the fact that he had put security on her daughter before she'd even known there was a reason to, and that his first move had been to make sure she could do her job without fear, and that he was apologizing now, not for the danger, but for the clumsiness of how she'd found out. Okay, she said. Okay. You'll tell me tonight, all of it. Not a question. All of it, he said. I promise. She went back to works. She served lunch to 3 tables and refilled water and smiled when it was appropriate, and kept the fact of her daughter's safety in the front of her mind like a light she could look at whenever the fear tried to come back. What Rowan did not tell her on the phone, what he hadn't yet told anyone outside of Finian, was that the situation had escalated in the 4 hours before he'd called her. At 7:15 that morning, Finian had intercepted a communication. A message sent through a channel that Garrett's people used for operational coordination in a cipher that Finian's team had broken 3 weeks ago and had been monitoring silently since. The message was brief. It said Tuesday, warehouse, end it. Tuesday, 4 days away. Finian had brought it to Rowan at 8 o'clock. They had sat with it for 20 minutes, neither of them saying the obvious thing, and then Rowan had said it. He's moving to an assassination. Finian hadn't argued. The window he's had is closing. He knows you're looking. He's calculating that acting now is better than waiting for you to complete the case. Does he know about the documentation? Not specifically, but he knows we're looking somewhere in the financial records. One of the accounts we pulled triggered an alert he'd set up. He would have seen the query. Finian's voice was very flat. He knows enough to know that time isn't on his side. Rowan had sat with this. Tuesday at a warehouse meant to set up something that would look like a rival move, something clean enough to be written off as the ordinary violence of the world they operated in, something that wouldn't point back to family. He's going to frame it, Rowan said. Yes, he'll have a narrative ready. External threat, rival operation. He'll have the story built before the body is found. Rowan looked at the window. He thought about the 60 seconds he had allowed himself that morning to feel the full weight of it. He thought about a man who had held his hand in a hospital room and promised to find whoever had hurt him while knowing that he was the one who had paid for it. We moved the timeline, Rowan said. We can't wait another week for the full documentation. What we have now is strong, Finian said. It's documentable and it's damning. It's not everything you wanted, but it's enough. Then we go to the council. Not Tuesday, before Tuesday. He looked at Finian. Sunday. A pause. 2 days. 2 days. Get the documentation compiled. Get the testimony in order. And reach out to Callahan and Murrow, the 2 council members we're sure of. I want them to know what's coming before Sunday so they're not walking in cold. Finian nodded. Then he said very quietly, and Garrett. Garrett doesn't know about Sunday. He's still planning for Tuesday. Rowan's voice was steady. Let him. Finian left. Rowan had sat alone for a long time, and then he had made the arrangements for Megan and her family, and then he had gone into the longest and most operationally complex day he had experienced since before the shooting. He told Megan everything that evening. Not on the phone, he sent Marcus to the hotel at the end of her shift with a car and brought her to the suite, and he sat across from her at the table where they'd had chocolate cake 3 weeks ago and told her. He told her about Garrett and the financial transfers and the burner phone and the preempted birthday calls. He told her about the payment to Vasquez, which was the hardest part, because saying it out loud to someone who was looking at him directly was different from turning it over in his own head. He told her about the message Finian had intercepted and the Tuesday plan and the decision to go to the council on Sunday. He told her all of it, like he'd promised. Megan listened without interrupting. She had a stillness when she was taking in something important, not passive, not checked out, but the kind of stillness that meant she was giving the thing her full attention without letting her face process it in real time. She sat with her hands on the table and listened to everything. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your cousin paid for the shooting." "Yes." "The same man who you grew up with?" "Yes." She looked at him. "How are you doing with that?" He opened his mouth to give the answer he gave to everything, which was the controlled level non-answer that redirected the question toward logistics and action. Then he looked at her face, which was asking the question the same way it had asked whether he was okay 3 weeks ago directly without softening with the expectation of a real answer. "I'm doing what I do," he said. "I'm working." "That's not the same as okay." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand on the table, not reaching for his, just putting it there close enough that it was a presence, close enough that he could feel the warmth of it without it requiring anything from either of them. "Sunday," she said. "You bring the evidence to the council on Sunday?" "Yes." "And then it's over." He looked at her hand on the table. He looked at the window. He thought about what over meant in the context of a world where things didn't end cleanly, where the removal of one person from a structure didn't dissolve the structure, where 20 years of what he'd built didn't simply become something else because one betrayer had been exposed. "It's the beginning of over," he said, "which is different." She nodded. She understood the distinction. He could see it in her face. She was not naive about complexity, had never been, which was one of the things that had surprised him about her from the beginning. She didn't expect clean. "Piper asked about you yesterday," she said. "She wants to know if you've thought of your wish yet." The shift in subject was so abrupt and so deliberate that it hit him, the way a window opening hits you, sudden air, different temperature, something changing in the room. He looked at her and understood that she had done it on purpose, given him a door, something to walk through that wasn't the weight of Garrett and the council on Tuesday. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "She'll want specifics." "I know," he paused. "I think I have one." She looked at him. "What is it?" He looked at her hand on the table. He looked at the window. He thought about what he was building in Finian's office and what he was trying to protect in this room and what it meant that those two things were happening at the same time inside the same person and that he was no longer entirely sure which one was more important. "This," he said. "I think the wish is this." Megan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good wish." "I thought so." She pulled her hand back and stood up, picking up her jacket from the back of the chair. "I need to get home. My mother has Piper and she gets tired." She paused at the chair, looking at him. "Rowan." "Yeah. Come back from Sunday in one piece. That's the plan." She looked at him for one more moment, with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to say something and then deciding to say it anyway. "You're a better man than you think you are," she said. "I don't know if anyone tells you that, but it's true." She left. He heard the door close behind her. He sat in the quiet and held what she'd said the way he'd been learning to hold things carefully without crushing them, giving them the space to be what they were. He thought, "I have to survive Sunday first." Then he picked up his phone and called Finian and went back to work. Saturday passed in a blur of documentation and logistics. Finian had compiled the evidence into a format that was clear, sequential, and impossible to argue with financial records, call logs, the incorporation documents, linking Dries to the Vasquez payment, the timeline of the Shell transfers. It was as Finian had said, enough, more than enough. Rowan reviewed it twice and found nothing he would have done differently. He called Callahan at noon. Vincent Callahan was 61, had been on the council for 14 years, and was one of 3 men in the organization whose loyalty Rowan trusted completely. Because Callahan's loyalty was not to Rowan specifically, but to the principle of order, to the idea that the machinery should be maintained, that betrayal from within was the most corrosive force in any operation, and that it should be met with absolute and documented consequence. Callahan listened to the summary without interrupting. When Rowan finished, there was a pause. "Garrett," Callahan said. "Yes." Another pause. Longer. You have documentation on the shooting connection. The payment to Vasquez, 3 shells but fully traceable. Finian has the full chain. Christ! A pause that held something personal in it. Callahan had also been at the restaurant that November night, had arrived at the hospital 2 hours after the shooting, had also sat in the waiting room, had also been told that it didn't look good. Tomorrow, I want it settled before Tuesday. He won't know what's coming. No. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll be there. And I'll bring Murrow. A pause. Rowan, what do you want done with him? Rowan thought about this. He had thought about it many times. He had run through every version of what the world he'd operated in for 20 years would call the appropriate consequence. The version that sent a message. The version that maintained order. The version that made clear what happened to men who orchestrated the killing of the person above them. He had run through all of those versions, and he had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. I want him removed from every position and every account, he said. I want him stripped of everything he built inside this organization. And then I want him handed to the federal authorities. A pause. I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The evidence we have is enough for a criminal prosecution. I want him to spend the rest of his life in a courtroom and then in a cell. Callahan was very quiet. That's not the traditional approach. No, Rowan said. It's not. Another pause. You've thought about this. For 6 weeks. And you're certain? I'm certain. His voice was completely level. He doesn't get to disappear. He gets to sit in a room while every documented thing he did gets read out loud in front of a judge. He gets to be accountable. A pause. That's worse. For a man like Garrett, that's significantly worse. Callahan was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I'll see you tomorrow. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold. Rowan had slept 4 hours. He did not feel the deficit he had run on less during worse situations, and the particular clarity that comes with knowing exactly what you're doing and why tends to compensate for things the body is missing. Marcus drove him to the location at 9:30. The council met in a building in Back Bay that had been used for this purpose for 11 years, a private room on the 3rd floor. No windows that faced the street, no recording of any kind allowed and enforced by a tradition that was older than anyone in the room. Garrett walked in at 10 o'clock, which was the time he'd been given, and Rowan watched his cousin's face in the moment when he came through the door and understood from the configuration of the room, from the faces of Callahan and Murrow and the 3 other council members who were present from the folder, open on the table from Rowan's expression, which was not the controlled warmth of their family dinners, but the face he'd been learning for 3 years to put on in rooms like this one that he had miscalculated. Garrett's face went through 3 emotions in under 2 seconds. Rowan watched each of them. First, recognition. The immediate gut-level understanding of what he had walked into. Second, calculation. The rapid, trained assessment of whether there was a version of this that could be navigated. Third, something that might have been under different circumstances relief. The specific exhale of a man who has been running a very long way and has finally been caught. Garrett, Rowan said. His voice was quiet and entirely steady. Sit down. Garrett sat. He looked at the folder. He looked at Rowan. He looked at Callahan, who looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been in this organization for 14 years and has seen betrayal and has never stopped being disgusted by it. How long have you known? Garrett asked. 6 weeks, Rowan said. Since the birthday. Garrett looked at the table. The birthday was the push. The birthday was the confirmation. Rowan looked at his cousin. The accumulation was longer than that. I just didn't let myself name it. A silence. The shooting, Garrett said. He said it quietly without dressing it up. Yes. Garrett looked at his hands. I want you to know. Don't. Rowan's voice didn't change in volume. It changed in something else. Something underneath the volume in the bedrock of it. Don't tell me what you want me to know. Everything you want me to know is in this folder. Every decision you made over 18 months is documented and traceable. There is nothing you can add to that. Garrett was quiet. You're going to be removed from every position and every account effective today, Rowan said. Everything you own inside this organization reverts to the general holding. and then you're going to be handed to the federal authorities with this documentation and a cooperation agreement from our legal team." Garrett looked up. His expression was not what Rowan expected. Not fury, not denial, something older than that. "You're going to put me in front of a judge." "Yes. You could... I know what I could do." Rowan looked at his cousin, at the face he'd known since childhood, at the man who had sat in his hospital room and held his hand. "This is what I've chosen to do, because you're going to spend a very long time being accountable for what you did in a room where everything gets said out loud, and that is going to be far more consequential for you than any other option." Garrett looked at him for a long moment, and in his face, everything underneath the calculation and the recognition and the 3 years of betrayal, Rowan saw something that might have been shame, the real kind, the kind that knows it has no argument left. He sat back in his chair and said nothing. Rowan looked at Finian, who was standing near the door. Finian nodded once. It was done. On the drive back, Marcus didn't say anything. He drove and let the quiet be what it was. Rowan sat in the back and looked at the city going past the window, the streets he'd built on and bled on and nearly died on, and felt the specific weight of something that had been pressing on him for 3 years, lift by some small but real degree, not gone. Things like that didn't go all at once, but lighter. He thought about Piper's question. What would he wish for? He thought about Megan's hand on the table close enough to be a presence. He thought about what she'd said at the door. "You're a better man than you think you are." He had spent 20 years building an empire that had ultimately tried to destroy him. He was looking now at what might come after, what it could look like to build something that didn't run on fear, what it felt like to be in a room where someone had put a flower on your cake, not because they wanted something, but because they saw you were alone and thought you shouldn't be. He had a wish. He'd told Megan that. He was starting to understand what it was going to take to make it real. The city moved past the window. The war, which had been building for 18 months and silent for 6 weeks and finally spoken aloud in a room in Back Bay, was beginning to be over, the beginning of over, which, like he'd told her, was different. But it was something. The Tuesday that Garrett had planned for came and went like any other day. Rowan spent it in a meeting with 2 attorneys and a financial restructuring consultant, beginning the documented process of unwinding the damage that had been done to the organization's accounts over the previous 18 months. It was detailed, unglamorous work, spreadsheets and account histories and legal frameworks, and it was exactly the kind of work that needed to happen before anything else could be built. He had learned over 20 years that the unglamorous work was always the most important. Anyone could make a dramatic move. The people who lasted were the ones who were willing to sit in a room for 6 hours with a spreadsheet afterward. Finian had delivered the documentation package to the U.S. Attorney's Office on Monday morning. Rowan's contact there, a woman named Diane Cho, who had been building cases against organized crime in Boston for 11 years, and who had a reputation for being absolutely unmovable once she decided something was true, had called him personally at 4 in the afternoon. "This is comprehensive," she'd said, in the voice of someone who was working hard to stay professional about something that was professionally significant. "The Vasquez payment chain alone is going to take my team 2 weeks to fully process." "Take what you need," Rowan had said. "You understand that this implicates you in certain areas as well." She'd said it carefully. "The accounts, the organizational structure. I understand." He'd paused. "That's part of why I'm bringing it to you. Full disclosure. I want this done in a room with lights on." A longer pause. "Mr. Hale, I've been doing this for 11 years. I have never received a call like this one." "I know," he'd said. "That's also part of why I'm making it." Garrett had been detained on Monday evening. Rowan wasn't told the details of the arrest and didn't ask for them. What he knew was that it had happened, that it was documented, and that the process was moving forward in the hands of people whose job it was to manage it. He had handed it over. That was the thing he'd decided to do, and he had done it, and now it belonged to a different set of hands. He thought about that on Tuesday evening, sitting in his office after the attorneys had gone, the handing over. He had spent 20 years believing that control absolute, maintained, never relinquished, was the only currency that mattered. that the moment you gave something to someone else to manage was the moment it became vulnerable. He had built an entire empire on the principle of keeping everything within reach, within his own oversight, within systems he had designed and understood completely. And someone inside those systems had nearly killed him, had actually for 4 minutes on an operating table succeeded. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Megan. She answered on the second ring. He could hear Piper in the background, something about a school project involving poster board, and the sound of it, ordinary domestic, entirely outside the world of documentation and council meetings and federal attorneys, hit him somewhere that surprised him. "It's done," he said. A pause. Then Piper's voice in the background receded slightly, and Megan said, "Tell me," he told her. Not the operational details, those weren't hers to carry, but the shape of it. That the documentation had gone to the right people, that Garrett had been detained, that Tuesday had come and gone without incident. "Are you okay?" she asked. The same question she always asked, direct without softening, expecting a real answer. "I think so," he said. "I think I'm getting there. I think Piper wants to know if we're still on for Saturday," Megan said, and he could hear in her voice that she was smiling slightly at the absurdity of that sentence in the context of what had just happened. This pivot from federal documentation to a 6-year-old's Saturday plans, and he found himself, to his own surprise, smiling too. "Tell her yes," he said, "and tell her I have something for her." A pause. "Rowan, what did you do?" "Tell her Saturday." He hung up and sat in the quiet of his office and felt the smile stay on his face for a moment longer than he'd expected. That was new, smiling in an empty room, not because something was strategically appropriate, but because something was genuinely funny and genuinely warm and genuinely his. New was good. He was deciding that new was good. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of work. Not dramatic, not climactic, just the daily sustained effort of dismantling something that had been built wrong and thinking carefully about what to put in its place. Finian worked with the federal attorneys on the documentation. The organizational accounts were restructured under the oversight of an independent auditor, which Rowan had insisted on, and which Callahan had supported, and which several other council members had needed to be persuaded to accept. The persuasion had been another kind of work-patient, deliberate, one conversation at a time. 2 of the 30 men from the birthday dinner came to him. Not the others. The others stayed away, which was its own kind of answer about who they were. But 2 of them came separately within 2 weeks of Garrett's detention. One was a man named Caruso, who had been with Rowan for 9 years. He sat across from Rowan in the Back Bay building and said without preamble, "I should have come to the dinner. I heard from Garrett's people and I let it scare me. That was wrong and I'm telling you directly." Rowan had looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me now?" Caruso had met his eyes. "Because you handed Garrett to the feds instead of doing what most people in your position would have done. And that made me think that the version of you that exists right now is someone I want to work for." A pause. "If you'll have me." Rowan had thought about this. He had thought about 30 empty chairs, and a woman who had sat down anyway, and a child who had put a flower on a cake. He had thought about what he was building now versus what he had built before, and what the difference between them was. "We're restructuring," he said. "What I'm building going forward looks different from what you've been part of. If you can work inside that, then yes." Caruso had nodded. "Tell me what it looks like." That conversation happened 4 times over the following month with 4 different people. Each time Rowan told them the same thing. What he was building looked different. The question was whether they could work inside different. Some could, some couldn't. He was learning to be at peace with that. Diane Cho called him on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the handover. "The grand jury has returned an indictment," she said. 31 counts, including the Vasquez connection. A pause. "Your cousin is going to trial." "I know," Rowan said. "You may be called as a witness." "I know that too." Another pause. "Mr. Hale, the cooperation you've provided in this case is going to be part of the record. People are going to know about it." He understood what she was telling him, that the world he had built and operated in for 20 years was going to know that he had handed his own cousin to the federal government with a documented evidence package. that some people in that world would see it as a weakness, that the narrative of what Rowan Hale was, the reputation, the fear, the carefully maintained image of someone untouchable, was going to be irrevocably changed by what he had chosen. "Good," he said. Cho was quiet for a moment. "Good. I've been thinking about what I want the next 20 years to look like," he said. "The reputation I built in the last 20 isn't the one I want to carry into them." She was quiet for another moment. "Then, I'll be in touch about the witness schedule." He hung up. He sat in his office and thought about reputation and what it was made of and what it cost to maintain and what the world looked like when you decided to stop paying that cost. He thought about fear as a foundation. He thought about 30 empty chairs and what they had cost him and what they had given him, which was the clarity he hadn't known he needed, the proof delivered in the most brutal way possible, that everything he'd built on fear could be dismantled by fear, because that was the nature of fear. It was not a foundation. It was a dependency. And dependencies could always be turned against you by someone who understood them better than you did. He thought about a different foundation. He had been thinking about it for weeks. He had been talking to people, not lieutenants, not attorneys, not council members, but different people. A woman who ran a nonprofit that provided transitional housing for single mothers in Dorchester. A man who directed a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in South Boston. A pediatrician who had been trying for 3 years to open a community health clinic in Roxbury and kept running into funding walls. He had been listening. He had been learning what the gaps were and where money could do something real. Saturday arrived. Piper came through the hotel suite door at 10:15 with the energy of a child who has been looking forward to something since Wednesday and has been extremely patient about it and is now done being patient. "You said you had something for me," she said before she was fully inside the room. "Good morning," Rowan said. "Good morning. What is it?" Megan, coming in behind her, gave him a look that was simultaneously apologetic and amused. "She has been asking that question approximately every 4 hours since Tuesday." "I heard," he said. "Marcus told me." Piper's eyes went to something near the side of the room. She stopped walking. She went completely still in the way children go still when they are confronted with something their brain needs a full second to process. The dog was a medium-sized golden mix, maybe 2 years old, with the temperament of an animal that had been evaluated very carefully for suitability around children and had passed every assessment with what the rescue coordinator had described as flying colors and a lot of tail wagging. He was sitting next to Marcus, who was holding his leash with the expression of a man who had not anticipated that his professional duties would come to include animal supervision, but had adapted. Piper turned to look at Rowan. Her face was doing something he had never seen it do before, a kind of overwhelmed stillness, all the usual motion and directness, temporarily suspended by something too big for immediate expression. "Is that—" she started. "His name is Biscuit," Rowan said, "which is a name the rescue gave him and which you are absolutely allowed to change." "Biscuit," Piper repeated. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her with the whole body attention that golden mixes give to people they have decided are important. His tail was doing something seismic. "He's yours," Rowan said, "if your mom says yes." Piper turned to Megan. The expression on her face was the entire argument. Megan looked at Rowan. He looked back at her. He could see her working through approximately 15 practical objections: the apartment, the schedule, the cost, the logistics, and he could also see her looking at her daughter's face and watching every one of those objections become irrelevant. "He's house-trained," Megan said. "Completely," Rowan said, "and calm. And already vet-checked, and I've arranged for a year of food and care costs to be covered before you say anything about that." "I was going to say something about that." "I know. Say it anyway." She looked at him. "You can't just—" "Your daughter wished for a dog," he said. "I have the means to make that happen. And the other wish—" He paused. "I'm working on the other one separately. That one takes longer." Megan looked at him. Something moved in her face, the complicated thing quieter than it used to be, more like something that had found its level. "Rowan." "Piper," he said without taking his eyes off Megan. "You can go say hello to Biscuit." Piper was already moving. The sound that followed a child and a dog discovering each other in real time, all delighted chaos and tail and small hands filled the room in a way that rooms in Rowan Hale's world very rarely got filled, with something uncomplicated and entirely good. Megan watched her daughter for a moment, then she looked back at Rowan. "The other wish," she said, "my wish, about not being tired." "You've been working double shifts for 13 months, he said. "Your mother's medical expenses are covered. The debt is gone. You're still working like someone running from something." She was quiet. "I've been in conversations with the director of a foundation that supports working mothers in transition," he said. "There's a position, program coordination. It pays better than the hotel, the hours are regular, and it has actual benefits." He held her eyes. "I didn't apply for you. I just wanted you to know it exists. What you do with that is entirely yours." Megan looked at him for a long moment. "You've been busy," she said. "I've had a lot to think about." Apparently. She looked at Piper, who was now sitting on the floor with Biscuit in her lap, despite Biscuit being too large to be in anyone's lap, a fact that neither of them seemed to find relevant. She looked back at Rowan. "Why?" she said. "Not the dog, not the job, all of it. The debt, the security, everything. You keep doing things, and I keep trying to understand the shape of it." He thought about how to answer that. He thought about 30 empty chairs and a flower on a birthday cake, and a 4-minute absence from the world, and a 6-year-old asking a question that nobody else had asked in years. "Because you sat down," he said, "when you had every reason not to. You sat down and you stayed, and you didn't want anything from me except to be decent to each other." He paused. "I hadn't had that in a long time. I didn't know how much it cost not to have it until you showed me." The room was very quiet, except for Piper narrating something to Biscuit in a low, serious voice. Megan looked at him steadily. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes get when something has moved through them that they're not quite ready to name. "I'm going to apply for the job," she said. "Okay. And I'm still going to pay you back." "I know you are. And—" She stopped. She looked at her daughter on the floor with the dog, and then she looked at Rowan, and she said quietly and completely, "Thank you for the wish, for doing it the right way." He nodded once. He didn't trust himself to say more than that in this moment, and he had learned over these past months that some things didn't need more. The following year moved in a different rhythm than any year Rowan had lived before. Garrett's trial began in the fall and ran for 6 weeks. Rowan testified twice, both times in the level-documented, precise voice that Diane Cho had coached him on, though it hadn't needed much coaching. He told the truth. He told all of it. He sat in a courtroom and said out loud the things that had happened to him and the things he had built, and the things that had been done inside them, and he did not flinch, and he did not qualify, and he did not look at Garrett, who sat across the room in the way that men sit when they know exactly where they are and cannot change it. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in November. 31 counts, guilty on 28. Diane Cho called him within the hour. "It's done," she said. "Thank you," he said, and meant it without complication. He told Megan that evening. She was at her new job by then, had been for 4 months, and she answered the phone on the first ring because she'd been waiting. He told her the verdict, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How do you feel?" "Like something has been put down," he said. "Something heavy. I didn't realize how long I'd been carrying it until just now." She was quiet for another moment. "Come for dinner," she said. "Piper made something. I'm using the word made loosely. She supervised very closely while I cooked and considers this equivalent." He laughed, actually laughed, which was still a thing that surprised him slightly when it happened in full, the whole sound of it, unguarded, just there. "I'll be there in an hour." Biscuit will be very excited. "Tell him to manage his expectations." "I will tell him no such thing." He hung up. He sat in his office for a moment in the building he was still reconfiguring physically, operationally, fundamentally, and thought about the year behind him and what was in front. The foundation work had started in earnest 3 months ago. The transitional housing nonprofit had received its first significant donation from a restructured Hale Family Trust in September, enough to expand from 1 location to 3. The scholarship fund had received a commitment that would fund 30 students over the next 5 years. The community health clinic in Roxbury had broken ground in October with full funding secured and a medical director hired. None of these things had Rowan's name on them publicly. That was deliberate. He was not looking for credit. He was looking for the work to be done, which was a distinction he was still learning to maintain cleanly, because the old instinct, the 20-year habit of making sure that everything you did was legible as power, was not something that dissolved overnight. It was something you corrected consciously every time you noticed it pulling. He noticed it. He corrected it. He kept going. Finian had stayed. That mattered more than almost anything else. Finian, who had seen everything, who knew the full measure of what Rowan had been and what he had done and what he was trying to become, had simply kept showing up, doing the work, adapting to the new shape of things with the same steady reliability he had brought to the old shape. Rowan had asked him once why. They'd been at the end of a long day sitting in the Back Bay building with bad coffee, and Rowan had said simply, "You didn't have to stay." Finian had looked at him. "I know. So why did you?" Finian had thought about it for a moment. Then he'd said, "Because this version is harder, and harder is usually more worth doing." Rowan had sat with that. Then he'd finished his coffee, and they'd gone back to work. He arrived at Megan's apartment at 7:15. She buzzed him up, and he took the elevator to the 4th floor and knocked, and the door opened, and Biscuit hit him first, all warm weight and enthusiasm, and then Piper, who was 7 now and had recently become very interested in astronomy, appeared behind the dog and said, "Biscuit, personal space," in the voice of someone who had said this many times without significant result. "Hi," Rowan said. "Hi," Piper said. "Did you know that Saturn's rings are mostly ice? I did not know that. They're also really thin compared to how wide they are, like a piece of paper compared to a football field. That's remarkable." "I know." She stepped back to let him in. "Dinner is pasta. Mom made it, but I picked the sauce so it counts as collaborative. The best kind of dinner." Megan was in the kitchen, which was small and warm and smelled like garlic, and something that he had come to understand over the past year of dinners in this apartment was simply the smell of a home that was lived in and taken care of. She looked over her shoulder when he came in and said, "Verdict, guilty, 28 counts." She nodded once, turned back to the stove. "Sit down, 10 minutes." He sat at the kitchen table, small, slightly uneven on one leg, covered at one corner with Piper's astronomy homework, and Biscuit settled next to his chair, and Piper climbed into the seat across from him and opened the astronomy book to show him a diagram of the solar system, and the ordinary warmth of it moved through him, the way warmth does when you've been cold for a very long time and have finally completely stopped being cold. "Rowan," Piper said, looking up from the diagram. "Yeah. Did you make the wish the real one?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the same direct brown eyes she had used that first night in the birthday room when she had asked a question that nobody else had asked in years and had waited for a real answer. "I'm making it," he said. "It's the kind of wish that takes time." She thought about this seriously. "Like growing a plant. Something like that." She nodded, satisfied with the answer. "That's okay. Good things take time. Mrs. Ramos says that." "Mrs. Ramos is right." Piper looked at the diagram. "When it's done, will you tell me what it was?" He looked at her. He looked at Megan at the stove, her back to them, her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been 13 months ago when she'd walked into a birthday room terrified and decided to sit down anyway. He looked at Biscuit, who was asleep on his foot. He looked at the astronomy homework and the uneven table and the kitchen that smelled like garlic and home. "Yeah," he said, "when it's done." Dinner was pasta, and the specific tomato sauce that Piper had selected, and that Megan had made exactly right, and they ate and talked about Saturn's rings, and a book Megan was reading, and a field trip Piper's class was taking to the aquarium next month, and Piper lobbied extensively for the case that the aquarium should have otters and not just fish. And Megan said this wasn't really a decision anyone at the table could make, and Piper said Rowan probably knew people and looked at him with clear expectation. "I'll look into it," he said. Megan gave him a look. He kept his expression neutral. After dinner, while Piper was doing the last of her homework at the table and Biscuit was performing his nightly ritual of trying to fit entirely under the table despite being too large, Megan and Rowan sat with coffee and the quiet that had developed between them over a year of this comfortable with nothing in it that needed to be filled. "Next week," Megan said, "my mother wants to meet you." He looked at her. "You've told her about me." "I've told her some things." "What things?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "That you exist, that you've been part of our lives this year, that you're—" She stopped, thought about it. "That you're trying to be something different from what you were." He sat with that. "What did she say?" "She said she wants to meet you and decide for herself." A pause. "She's very direct. Piper gets it from her." He looked at the table, at his coffee, at the small, ordinary facts of this apartment and these people and this life that had opened up in front of him unplanned because a door had been left ajar and a little girl had walked through it looking for a bathroom. "I'd like that," he said. Megan looked at him. "She's going to ask you hard questions." "I know. You'll answer them honestly." "I will." She nodded. She looked at Piper, who was erasing something with great focus, and then she looked back at Rowan, and in her face was the thing that had been building there for a year, not hidden exactly, but held carefully the way she held everything that mattered. "You know what I think the wish is?" she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "Yeah. I think you've been making it for a while." "I think you're right." She picked up her coffee. "Then keep going," she said, simply, the way she said things when they were true, and she wanted them to land without ceremony. He kept going. 1 year after a birthday that no one attended, Rowan Hale sat at a table in a small apartment in Boston with a woman who had chosen to stay, and a child who had taught him what it meant to be seen without armor, and a dog who was too large for the space and didn't care. He sat at that table and felt the specific, unglamorous, entirely real weight of something that had been built correctly, not on fear, not on the belief that loyalty could be purchased, not on the performance of being untouchable, but on the only foundation that held, showing up, sitting down, putting a flower on the cake of someone who was alone, not because you wanted something, but because you could see they needed it. He had built an empire once and watched it empty out. What he was building now, one ordinary day at a time, would not empty out, because it was not held together by what people owed him or feared him. It was held together by what they had chosen, freely, with full knowledge of who he was and what he had been and what he was trying to become. That was the wish. That was the one he'd been making all along. And for the first time in a very long time, Rowan Hale looked at the life in front of him and understood with the same cold clarity he had once used only for strategy and survival that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not the Frost, not the man the city had feared, not the boss at the head of a table built for 30 people who didn't come, just a man at a small kitchen table with people who chose to stay. That was everything. That was enough.